There are known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. But there are also unknown knowns. The ancient and esoteric Order of the Jackalope is devoted to unearthing and sharing this knowledge in podcast form. Each episode we take some piece of miscellaneous esoterica that has slipped through the cracks of common knowledge and share it to you in an easily digestible format. No topic is off limits, except for the obvious. Hey there, Lodge members. Today's story comes to us courtesy of number 12, who told me all about it at a party. She graciously handed over her research notes and allowed me to carry it over the finish line. So while I'm doing all the talking today, I have to acknowledge that she's the one who did all the hard work. Thanks a lot. Today we have a story about art and racism. The Icelander, presented by number 12 and number 13. Ellen Phillips Samuel was the daughter of one of Philadelphia's wealthiest and most prominent Jewish families. They were proud members of the congregation Mikvah Israel, the oldest synagogue in the United States, and claimed descent from Haim Solomon, an early patriot who supported the American Revolution both by spying and by purchasing government debt, and who died penniless as a result. More recently, her uncle was Henry Meyer Phillips, the first Jewish congressman from Philadelphia and one of Philadelphia's most noteworthy nabobs. In 1913, as Mrs. Samuel felt her end approaching, she yearned to make a mark on the city she loved, just as her ancestors had. In her will, she left an endowment of $500,000 for the Fairmount Park Art Association, to be paid out after the death of her husband, Joseph Bunford Samuel, along with some specific notes about how it was to be used. There is a space of 2,000 feet commencing from the Beacon Light or last boathouse to the Girard Avenue Bridge. On the edge of this ground, bordered by the Schuylkill River, is a stone bulkhead. On top of this embankment, it is my will to have erected at distances of 100 feet apart, on high granite pedestals of uniform shape and size, statuary emblematic of the history of America, ranging in time from the earliest settler of America to the present era, arranged in chronological order, the earliest period at the south end, and going on to the present time at the north end, and when all the statues are in place, the income to be spent in buying statuary and fountains to decorate the park according to the judgment of the commissioners. The Fairmount Park Art Association was grateful to receive such a generous bequest. Well, grateful for the money at least. They hated every other aspect of it. They thought a series of statues lining Kelly Drive would be a hideous eyesore, so instead they hired architects to design 3 terraced sculpture gardens and eventually revealed their plans and a scale model to the public. The association hadn't reckoned with Ellen Phillips Samuel's husband, J. Bunford Samuel. He was very insistent that his wife's bequest was for statues and statues alone, and never hesitated to remind commissioners and the public of that fact. In the face of his objections, the commissioners decided to sit on their plans and take no public action. What would be the harm? They weren't going to get the money until after Samuel's death anyways, and this way they wouldn't have to listen to his kvetching all the time. But J. Bunford Samuel could see what the commissioners were doing. Rather than see his wife's wishes ignored, he decided he would have the first statue erected at his own expense. If he presented it to the Art Association as a fait accompli, they'd have to put it into place, and it would shame them into following the plans laid out in the bequest. Ellen's bequest specified that the statues should range in time from the earliest settler of America to the present era, so Bunford decided to start at the beginning, with the very first settler of America. But who could that be? Now, if we're being honest with ourselves, the earliest settlers were Native Americans, but this is the early 1900s, and there's no way anyone involved in this story was going to admit that. Now, you could always make a case for Jamestown, Virginia, or St. Augustine, Florida, for being the first permanent European settlements in North America. However, at the time there was a growing consensus that the earliest European settlers of North America were the Vikings. They had written about their explorations of Vinland in 2 Icelandic sagas, the Grenlandiga saga and the saga of Eric the Red, but they had long been dismissed as fanciful exaggerations or outright fabrications. In the late 19th century, scholars started to examine the sagas with a critical eye and realized they might be more accurate than previously thought. This was partly driven by increased access to the sagas themselves, and partly by the spirit of open-minded scientific inquiry. If it also happened to prove that a proper, white, northern European had discovered North America before some garlicky Italian or chorizo-chugging Spaniard, even better. So enter into our story, Thorfinn Karlsefni, son of Thor the Horsehead, son of Snorri, son of Thord, son of Bjorn Butterbox, son of Thorvald Trygg, son of Aslik, son of Bjorn Ironside, son of Ragnar Shaggy Breeches. Thorfinn was a wealthy man of noble lineage. He claimed descent from legendary Swedish king Ragnar Lothbrok and Irish king Kjærval mac Dunlaia. All the historical sources agree he was totally awesome. So awesome that his nickname, Karlsefni, is basically an idiomatic way of saying, "What a man!" Sometime around 1000 CE, Thorfinn arrived in Greenland from Norway. The sagas are silent as to why he traveled to Greenland, but let's be honest, no one went to Greenland if they had options back in Europe. While wintering with Leif Erikson, he married Guthrid, the widow of Leif's brother Thorstein, and the happy couple decided to make their home in Vinland. In spring, Thorfinn and Guthrid set off for Vinland with a mixed party of men and women. They landed at Stromfjord, where Leif had built some temporary housing on one of his previous voyages, and spent their first year clearing the land around those houses for agriculture, and lived off the land. Guthrid even gave birth to Thorfinn's son Snorri, the first European born in North America. Take that, Virginia Dare. Later, the settlers had their first encounters with the mysterious Skraelings, likely tribes of the pre-Inuit Dorset people. Their first encounters were peaceful, but put the Vikings on edge. Later encounters turned violent, and the Vikings only survived because the Skraelings were superstitious and fearful. Realizing that they were hopelessly outnumbered, Thorfinn and his party gathered all the produce they could and sailed back to Greenland. After a few profitable trading expeditions between Greenland and Norway, Thorfinn retired to Iceland and passed into legend. That's the version of the story in the Greenlandiga saga, at least. The saga of Eric the Red agrees on the outline but differs in the details, whether Karlsefni traveled with Leif's brother Thorvald and sister Freydis, how long they stayed in Vinland, exactly how their encounters with the Skraelings played out. Of course, the saga of Eric the Red also claims that Thorfinn and company also encountered a legendary one-footed creature who shot Thorvald Eriksson in the junk with an arrow. There's a little poem in the saga about it which is too good not to share, but I have no idea what Icelandic poetry is supposed to sound like, so please forgive my interpretation here. Yes, it is true that a man chased a uniped down to the sea. Weird creature ran like the wind over rough ground. Hear that, Karlsefni? So yeah, maybe take everything in the saga of Eric the Red with a grain of salt. A whole cellar if you have one to spare. If you're looking for someone to be the first European settler of North America, Thorfinn Karlsefni is a fine choice. There's only one problem: a complete lack of archaeological evidence of Viking colonization. Today, of course, we know all about the Viking settlement at L'Anso Meadows on Newfoundland, but that wasn't discovered until 1960. Other evidence would have to suffice. Almost every region along the east coast had some old rock covered with crude markings, either natural or man-made. As the search for evidence of Viking settlements expanded, these old rocks were suddenly discovered to be runestones containing messages left by Viking explorers, proving that they'd been everywhere from St. John's to Long Island, sometimes even as far inland as Minnesota and Oklahoma. Most of them were obvious frauds. Others have markings so vague that over the years they've been interpreted to be Norse, Celtic, French, Hungarian, even Phoenician or Japanese. Truth be told, if they're anything, they're probably Native American pictographs, but again, it's 1900. No one involved in the story is going to admit that. But the archaeologists of the late 19th century frequently took them to be legitimate evidence of Viking colonization. One of these runestones was discovered near Yarmouth, Nova Scotia in 1819. It remained a curiosity until 1884, when an amateur archaeologist declared it was neither a modern fraud nor the work of the wayward playfulness of the leisure hours of the sportive redskin. He claimed the description was runic and translated it as Hako's son addressed the men. He associated the Hako of the inscription with a slave named Haki from the saga of Eric the Red, and pronounced it conclusive proof that the Vikings had landed in Nova Scotia. As J. Bunford Samuel researched the early settlers of America, he stumbled across that amateur scholar's paper. He also stumbled across any number of careful, reasoned refutations of those arguments. Those refutations didn't have as much weight as the name attached to that first paper, though. It was Henry M. Phillips, Jr., his late brother-in-law. Conclusive evidence of the first settler in America, provided by his late wife's own brother, was too perfect to be true. J. Bunford Samuel had the subject for a statue. Of course, he still needed to get that statue made. Local artists seemed suspiciously uninterested in the lucrative commission, perhaps fearing the wrath of the grandees of the Fairmount Park Art Association. Then Bunford's friend Henry Goddard Leach, president of the American Scandinavian Foundation, made a brilliant suggestion: get an Icelander to sculpt an Icelander. Leach introduced Samuel to Einar Jonsson, the greatest Icelandic artist of the day. He was perfect for the project as he had a powerful expressionistic style and a deep interest in Icelandic history and folklore. The composition he came up with was simple but powerful. A fresh-faced young Thorfinn leaning on his axe and peering adventurously into the future while he carries the legacy of his past on his back via an inscription on his shield. Einar made several trips to the United States to work on the statue, supervise the casting, and design a pedestal. By 1919, Thorfinn Karlsefni was complete, and a beaming J. Bunford Samuel presented him to the Fairmount Park Art Association, who stuck it in a utility shed. Just let it sit there for almost 2 years. When Bunford asked them to explain themselves, the only response he could get was that the statue was being worked on. Eventually, Samuel was able to badger the Art Association into installing the statue, and the unveiling was scheduled for 2:30 p.m. on November 20th, 1920. A number of impressive guests were invited, including George Beck, Consul General of Denmark and Iceland, representatives of the American Scandinavian Foundation, Dr. Halder Hermansen of Cornell University, the nation's leading authority on Icelandic history and language, and the editors of America's largest Norwegian and Danish language newspapers. When the time came for the unveiling, the commissioners and visiting dignitaries were nowhere to be found. One of the park guards decided that it looked like rain, and he'd rather not wait around to find out if it was. He seized the initiative and whipped the tarp off. Of course, that was when the commissioners finally arrived. They were being photographed for a group portrait at City Hall and got stuck in a traffic jam. Whoops. They made some perfunctory speeches explaining just why there was a statue of a Viking in Philadelphia and calling it a major milestone in American-Icelandic relations. And then they retired somewhere for brandy and cigars, and maybe, just this once, pickled herring. Over the years, the handsome statue became a favorite of the people of Philadelphia, also the people of Iceland and Denmark. J. Bunford Samuel was even elevated to the Order of the Falcon, Iceland's only chivalric order, by King Christian X in 1929. But to the Fairmount Park Art Association, Thorfinn Karlsefni was still an eyesore that didn't fit in with their plans. When J. Bunford Samuel finally died in 1929, they went full steam ahead with their terraced sculpture gardens, which were completed in 3 stages between 1933 and 1961. Critics and the public were not so entranced with the sculptures erected by the Art Association. The terraces were nice, and the landscaping and gardens were top-notch, but the sculptures? Yeah. One critic claimed that the first completed statue, Robert Lorentz' The Spanning of the Continent, looked like it was hit on the head and banged up from the bottom. Let's be honest, many of the statues are nice, but forgettable, with the possible exception of Jock Lipschitz's powerful The Spirit of Enterprise. Meanwhile, Thorfinn Karlsefni stood his lonely vigil on the banks of the Schuylkill River. As the years went by, he became a focal point for Philadelphia's Leif Erikson Day celebrations. If you don't celebrate Leif Erikson Day where you live, just think of it as another ethnic holiday, a light-hearted celebration of pan-Scandinavian heritage. It's usually celebrated on October 9th, and while the date itself is not particularly significant, you have to imagine some celebrants are probably tickled that it usually falls a few days before Columbus Day on the calendar. Most years, there might just be a picnic or a speech by the statue. If you were lucky, there might even be a recreation of Leif Erikson landing on the shores of Vinland, complete with a replica Viking longboat crewed by proud, slightly inebriated Scandinavian Americans. It was all about as historically accurate as an episode of Hercules: The Legendary Journeys, but who cares? A good time was had by all. But sometime in the mid-2000s, those celebrations turned dark when they were taken over by white supremacists. Like Hitler, they saw the Vikings as an unconquered bastion of pure Germanic whiteness. Since the statue was the only Viking site in Philadelphia of any significance, the skinheads chose it as a rallying point. Poor Thorfinn was probably confused, because skinhead ideas of whiteness and racial purity would have been completely alien to him. The organizer of these white power rallies is Keystone United. They used to be the Keystone State Skinheads, but they changed it because it's hard to pretend you're the good guys when skinhead is right there in your name. Like many white supremacist organizations, Keystone United tries to present themselves as a non-controversial organization safeguarding the rights of white Americans against the rising tide of diversity, but its members have a long history of violent, racially motivated assaults. They're classified by the Southern Poverty Law Center as a hate group. The first few Keystone State skinhead rallies at the statue were low-key impromptu gatherings. Their 2000 event drew some 75 skinheads to Fairmount Park, but was also notable for being a comedy of errors. Since they were operating without a permit, they'd failed to notice that their rally was scheduled for the same time as a regatta. They were squeezed out of the area around the statue and had to cut their festivities short. They laid a wreath at the feet of the statue, but then snatched it back a few minutes later since once again they were operating without a permit and didn't want to pay a $500 fine for littering. At least one passerby was confused by the KSS logos on their shirts and thought he was watching a reunion of the KISS Army. During the Obama years, Keystone United's numbers started to dwindle. As their celebrations got smaller, though, they got louder. They also attracted anti-racist counter-protests, which quickly grew to dwarf the offending rallies. The sight of skinheads being stared down by a coalition of African Americans, anarchists, drag queens, and Antifa was something to behold. The real victim of this was the poor Thorfinn Karlsefni statue. Before, it had slid into sort of a benign obscurity, but now Philadelphians thought of it as the place where all the skinheads hang out. In advance of the October 2017 rally, vandals defaced the statue with red spray paint, anarchist symbols, and anti-Nazi language. You can make an educated guess as what that language might be, but they're blurred in most news reports, so I can't say for sure. But soon Thorfinn was cleaned up and as good as new. He didn't fare so well on October 2nd, 2018. Philadelphia police officers responding to a vandalism in progress call discovered that the statue had been knocked off of its pedestal and dragged into the Schuylkill. Most people assumed the statue was toppled to spoil Keystone United's fun, but it was also noted that the Philadelphia Eagles were facing off against the Minnesota Vikings the following weekend. So, either the work of Antifa or rabid football fans. Either explanation seems equally plausible. Never change, Philadelphia. The city used divers and a crane to extract the Viking explorer from the muck at the bottom of the Schuylkill and get him into a conservator's studio. The damage was extensive, so this wouldn't be a quick polish like the previous year's cleanup. It would require time and money. The city also had to grapple with the fact that the local monument had been appropriated by white nationalists and figure out what they could do to prevent further abuse from either side of the debate. And then 2020 happened, and no statue was safe. You'd think Thorfinn would be relatively insulated from the debate, if only because he was relatively obscure and didn't leave much of an ongoing stain on our national fabric. Then again, if you were one of his Irish or Scottish slaves, you might think differently. And he did kill quite a few Skraelings while he was here. Thanks to these thorny issues, Thorfinn is still gone from Fairmount Park today, nearly 2 years later. Will he ever return to his pedestal? Well, I don't know. Go ask Kirk Savage. He's probably got a better idea. I do hope some solution can be found, whether the statue is given a few extra coats of graffiti-resistant paint or relocated indoors to the art museum. Einar Jansson's artistry deserves an appreciative audience. If you are dying to see Thorfinn in all his glory, though, there is another casting of the statue. Unfortunately, it's in Reykjavik, so good luck with that. This episode was pulled together largely from newspaper stories, so I'd like to thank all the Philadelphia reporters who covered the Thorfinn Karlsefni statue controversies over the years, especially Claire Sasko, Dana DiFilippo, Patricia Madej, and Stephanie Farr. I'd also heartily recommend J. Bunford Samuel's self-published The Icelander Thorfinn Karlsefni Who Visited the Western Hemisphere in 1007, which goes into painstaking detail about the statue's creation. It's available for free on the internet over at Hothy Trust. Check it out. You should also check out Magnus Magnusson and Herman Palson's translation of the Vinland Sagas. They're short, and it's interesting to see the wild differences in two accounts of the same events. And while you're at it, watch the Vinland Saga anime. It's not historically accurate, but it's fun. And of course, thanks again to number 12 for bringing this to our attention and handing us an already completed story. Thanks, Jen. You're the best. Connections. One of the pieces commissioned for the Ellen Phillips Samuel Memorial was Sir Jacob Epstein's Social Consciousness. Unfortunately, the finished piece turned out to be too large to fit in the plan and was relocated to the University of Pennsylvania. Early in his career, one of Epstein's most important patrons was John Quinn. Quinn was also a patron of Romanian sculptor Constantin Brancuș, whose brush with the law we covered in Series 1, The Brouhaha. And one more thing before we go. I'd like to share this quote from Einar Jansson, which just couldn't fit into the story, but which is awesome. In my opinion, nothing is more dangerous to art than tradition. I've lived in Italy, Hungary, Austria, Bavaria, Germany, England, and Denmark, and have seen various art collections in these countries. Always I have seen the same, the ghastly tradition and routine which rules them all, and which spreads like a death-bringing slime over all young art. Until next time, Lodge members. This podcast was produced by Jen Voss and David White for the Ancient and Esoteric Order of the Jackalope. It is released under a Creative Commons 4.0 Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike 4.0 International License. All rights reserved, all wrongs reversed. The full script of this episode with sources, links, and more can be found on our website at orderofthejackalope.com. That's orderofthejackalope.com with hyphens between the words. Keep up with our latest updates on social media at Order Jackalope on Twitter, Tumblr, Instagram, and Reddit. Or contact us via email at jackalope@orderofthejackalope.com. Want to join the fastest growing secret society in the nation? We'll show you our hidden secrets if you show us yours first. Visit our website and click Join Us for more information.